My phone.
Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of talking to Dr. Francis Buckley at George Mason University in Northern Virginia, outside Washington, D.C., about his relatively new book, which I found very intriguing. The Roots of Liberalism: What Faithful Knights and the Little Match Girl Taught Us About Civic Virtue. So, Dr. Buckley, thank you for joining this conversation.
Mark, thanks so much for having me. Call me Frank, please.
Frank, if I had to summarize in one or two sentences your book, it is essentially that liberalism, quote unquote, is not a philosophy, but really more of an intuition and an understanding. Is that correct? And please elaborate.
Yeah, and really what I wanted to do was rescue liberalism from a bunch of modern anti-liberal people on the right who have some accusations to throw at the idea of liberalism. And in part, um, they've picked a fair target because some of what passes for liberalism today is vastly different from what we understood liberalism to mean back when. Um, so when I'm talking about liberalism, like my moral hero is Dwight Eisenhower, okay? Which kind of dates me. I go back to, hula hoops and the like. Um, but, in the time of Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, everybody was a liberal, right? And liberalism then didn't mean a kind of amoral classical liberalism. It didn't mean rational egoism, or the guy whom Tocqueville called an individualist who thinks that all that matters is rational self-interest. So I'm talking about the kind of liberalism that everyone would have subscribed to back then, and which I think everybody pretty much does now. And our problem is we've got a chattering class of podcasters and intellectuals and academics who are anti-liberal and who've tried to usurp, or at least formally, they tried to usurp the label of liberalism. And they purloined it, and that's not what it's all about. And I think when you properly understand the roots of liberalism, you're brought back to an earlier understanding of what it meant, rooted in, for example, religion, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Um, we are liberals in the sense that we believe that moral faults are committed by individuals and not by groups. So there's a modern understanding on the left of group responsibility and racial guilt, which is entirely inconsistent with Christianity, right? But in fact, that Christian understanding of moral responsibility is basic to our idea of liberalism, right? Um, the great change occurred with the introduction of Christianity and the way it replaced the classical Roman religion. In the Roman religion, as described by historians of the time, Fustel de Coulanges, women didn't count. So it took Christianity to say, no, 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 marriage is a sacrament. That means that we have to get the consent of both parties, right? And guilt is individual. So, we die alone. We die responsible for our own soul. Those are Christian ideas, and they're liberal ideas, and they're basic to our ideas of liberty and equality and individualism. So, all of that is something I think pretty much all Americans understand, unless they've been deluded by people on the left who try to usurp the label of liberalism, and the anti-liberals on the right who falsely or have forgotten our origins. So, you know, liberalism is rooted in ideas like the Good Samaritan and the duty to rescue. And that inspires a Western culture which can be found in missionaries, for example. I mean, missionaries are people who are not well regarded by moderns, by people who pretend to be up to date about things. The missionaries, however, are simply people who think that if the salvation of your soul is the most important thing that can possibly happen, then you would be cruelly indifferent to people if you didn't try to convert them. So, missionaries in that sense I regard as heroes, and I spent some time in the book talking about the early Jesuit missionaries um, in Quebec, for example, who were cruelly tortured, but who bravely died defending the faith. So those people were liberals. They were heroes of liberalism. Uh, it's a gross libel to deny that these people were anything other than liberals. The duty to rescue also finds itself expressed in ideas like, um, well, I was thinking, I wrote about the genocide in Rwanda. And in particular, I talked about a guy called Romeo Dallaire, who was a general on the ground at the time and who rescued about 30,000 Rwandans. He would have done more, and indeed, he had a crack up immediately afterwards, but really was a moral hero of liberalism. The ostensible liberals were the people who abandoned the Rwandans at the time, people like Bill Clinton. So um, that duty to rescue is basic to our understanding of one's duties as a Christian. Um, Another example of the same thing, again, these are stories rooted in our culture, and I guess what I want to do is describe a liberalism that goes back prior to Locke or John Stuart Mill, a liberalism based in things that we would understand as kind of necessary if you're going to be a decent person. One example of that, a classic story from one's youth, is the story of the Black Prince at the Battle of Poitiers. So the Black Prince in 1367, I think, with an army one-third the size of the French, captures all the French aristocracy and the King of France. And when it's all over, when the battle is over and when he's won, what he does is he assembles the king and the French nobles in a tent, and like a waiter, he serves them and tells them they should be happy with the result because they've acquitted themselves bravely and they will be thought to have been honorable people as a consequence. So, that kind of exquisite sense of what is owed to other people is the story of the Black Prince. And it's also the foundation of the Geneva Convention's duties as to prisoners of war. King John of France was a prisoner of war, and he was treated royally by the Black Prince. And that high standard of our obligations to people we've defeated in war comes down to us as an expression of the greatest kind of liberalism in the Geneva Convention. But where did it come from? It came from the traditions of chivalry. So that goes back to early stories of what it is to be a decent, ordinary Christian person. I also wanted to rescue the idea of virtue from the anti-liberals and to say that for an American, fidelity to the beliefs of the founders is crucial to the idea of liberalism. Now, the origins of our ideas about equality and liberty come to us from documents like the Declaration of Independence. Well, the Declaration of Independence is a classically liberal document. Frankly, it's rejected by progressives on the left who want to see, racial categories applied. The whole idea of racial justice is one in which individuals are not responsible, but races are, and what your moral duties depend on essentially race. That's a purely primitive moral code. I mean, we would have thought this shameful at any point prior to the last 10 years, shameful to espouse this kind of thing. So, if you're an American, therefore, what defines you as an American, I think, is your fidelity to the ideas of the founders, as expressed again by Lincoln, and that which is not liberal is not American. So, you can say you're an anti-liberal, but are you writing yourself out of membership in the American nation if you do that. And then I talked about odd things like um, Hans Christian Andersen. So, for a lot of people, their introduction to liberalism as a 10-year-old comes when they read or have read to them the stories of Hans Christian Andersen. One story which stuck in my mind, in my memory, was that of the little match girl. The little match girl is somebody who is selling matches, a 10-year-old girl selling matches in the streets of Copenhagen. And she's next to a restaurant, and she looks into the restaurant and she sees all these people dining. And she's so intrigued by the scene that as darkness descends, she takes one of her matches and lights it so she can see better. And when it's all over, she's lit all the matches and she's frozen to death. So if you experience that as a 10-year-old, you came across a basic notion of what liberalism is all about. Um, so in the end, therefore, I'm defining liberalism in a way that would include the Dwight Eisenhowers and the Adlai Stevensons, but wouldn't include the progressives, right? And and when we conservatives like me say, "Oh, were we were supportive of an earlier generation of Democrats," that's the sort of thing we have in mind, right? An earlier generation of Democrats that believed in social welfare and didn't believe in leaving the little match girls out alone to die of freeze to death in the cold. So all of that goes into our idea of liberalism, and I wanted to rescue that from, as I say, the anti-liberals left and right who scorn it. And I want to ask them to remember that that which is noble in our ideas of morality are basically liberal ideas, and they're rooted in stories about moral heroes like the Black Prince, and rooted in Christianity and the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Now, many of the post-liberals on the right are Christian, and they reject liberalism as secular, materialistic, individualistic. They trace it as a philosophy chiefly to John Locke. They end
Hmm.
up directly or indirectly rejecting the Declaration of Independence. How do you explain? Well, I guess you can't read their hearts or know their motives, but what do you think drives their impulse?
Well, some of these are people whom I know well and who've had their own experience with the culture wars at colleges, like ostensibly Catholic colleges like Georgetown. That describes Patrick Deneen, for example. I think what I'd want to say to them is well, there was a slogan during the occupation of France in the 1940s. There was a picture of Marshal Pétain. And so there's a great picture of the Marshal, and the slogan is, Êtes-vous plus français que lui? Are you more French than he is? So I want to hold up the picture of Lincoln to them and say, Are you more American than Lincoln? No,
Mm.
how could that be possible, right? Lincoln defines, I think, who you are as an American, importantly. And that's noble. So it may be what I'd want to do is to try to convert them to an understanding of liberalism, which is not that which they think it is, which is not a desiccated philosophy of a John Locke or whatever. So, if I want to ask them why they'd want to read Dwight Eisenhower, out of this, our moral heroes, please explain why, because it doesn't make sense to me.
Now, for young people, I assume you deal a lot with young people in your work. If they're politically active, many of them, right or left, are going to be post-liberal. That's where the action is. It's much more provocative, trying to defend someone like Dwight Eisenhower. Well, that's passe. How do you respond to these impulses among the politically active young who are bored and now disdain liberalism?
Well, what you don't particularly want to do, is get into a brawl with any of these people, but you might remind them that things that they hold dear are things that ordinary Americans hold dear as well. So you want to abstract them from the pleasant present political battles of one kind or another and go back to our understanding of the importance of equality and liberty. And then to point out that all of that's to be found in the founders' documents. So are you simply trying to express in your own way the same kinds of ideas that the founders did in the Declaration of Independence? If so, then we are not really in disagreement. But technically, the way in which those ideas are to be worked out is another matter.
And do you think for Christians, liberalism is where they need to be politically? That liberalism basically expresses a Christian ethic in the world?
Yes, I think I want to say that, but I want to remind them that I'm describing liberalism in so broad a manner that it would include people on pretty much every side of the political battles prior to the last 40 years. So, um, if you are somebody who believes in a decent safety net for people, fine, you're a liberal. If you entirely reject that, then I think you may have to rethink your position if it is the case that you felt no empathy for the little match girl.
Hmm. For someone today who shares your perspective and they've read your book, who else or what else should they be reading today to have the resources they need to defend and articulate liberalism?
Well, I think in the American tradition, um, if there's a one sentence way of explaining the American legal and political tradition is we don't do virtue here. So you have a James Madison, for example, who said, we don't need virtue, we have my institutions of government. And we have Tocqueville's individualist who said, we don't need virtue, we have rational self-choice. We have basically a rights theorist who says, we don't need liberalism and virtue because we have lawyers. And I want to say, no, there's something else going on here. There was a fellow called Fletcher Moulton, a law lord, an English judge of 100 years back, who said that it's very important to have law, but it's also important to have something else, which he called an obligation to the unenforceable. We have obligations to do things which are moral obligations and which are not rooted in law and which law can't touch, and what he described as virtue. So there is a place for the constraints of virtue which are not legal. I think that what you want to do to get started in all of this is to realize that we're talking about things that are not capable of being legislated. And in a way, that runs counter to certainly the way lawyers think, and to the way many people think. I mean, the idea that there ought to be a law, for example, right? Why don't we just sort of legislate that we make all things nice and beautiful? And we can't do that. And as we can't do that, we look for other sources, and we'll find them importantly, for example, in religion.
And Frank, finally, if I may, if you could get autobiographical, you are from Canada originally and became an American by choice. How did that affect your beliefs regarding liberalism?
Well, I come from Canada, from a Tory background in Canada, and that's made me, I think that's immunized me from John Locke, right? Or it's immunized me from kind of one sentence solutions to our problems. I think it's more complicated than that. But at the same time, um, I always had, but I deepened my appreciation for America and for America's political traditions. And so what I see as important is a way of working out the importance of virtue within a political tradition which often has tried to exclude it.
Dr. Francis Buckley, author of this book, The Roots of Liberalism: What Faithful Knights and the Little Match Girl Taught Us About Civic Virtue. Thank you very much for this very informative conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Great talking to you.